Welcome, everybody. Good evening. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first budget workshop of the 2019-2020 budget development. Just for everyone's awareness, we are streaming live, so audio is being streamed, and then the presentation is what people can see, so they can hear us, but they can't see us. They're just watching the presentation. Before we get into tonight's presentation, just a reminder, budget workshops are working sessions for the Board of Ed held in public. There is no comment period or questions from the public regarding the presentation. Certainly the board can accept them if they like, but it's a working session for the board. If there are questions that come from the work session, they can be asked in the general session. Under my report, I will have budget workshop update so that if any continuation of discussion needs to happen, and then during public comment period, certainly. So just a reminder for the for those that are in attendance. So from our calendar standpoint, tonight is actually it's our first budget workshop, but it's not the first conversation we've had regarding budget development. On February 14th, Kathy Blackman came and gave a current budget 18-19 recap update, and then a long-range projection for the next 5 years. And we've had that now. I think this is our 5th year, so that typically starts the process, and now tonight is our first draft of our 1920 budget, and we're going to spend a lot of time on expenditures. That's what we plan on digging into. Again, at the bottom, if you do want to stream this, or if you are streaming it, there's our website. That's where you can find it. It will be archived, and if there are any questions that come as a result of this meeting, whether you're in attendance tonight and you want to ask later after you leave, or if you're home listening and you want to email, this is a separate email address that comes into the board clerk, and then the Board of Education and myself see that, and then we try to respond within 24, 48 hours, depending on the question. So again, we would encourage folks to certainly reach out with any questions. And again, calendar, 28th, next board meeting will be another draft and a focus on revenue. We hope by that point, we hope that the state budget is approved, although it's due April 1st, so it may not. And then on the 11th will be our final recommendation for the budget. So the next 4 weeks are going to be highly concentrated. Tonight, in attendance, for those that are streaming live, Mr. Armazzani, Mr. Powell, Mr. Del Bianco, Ms. Williams, and Mr. Balzani. Ms. Bernard and Ms. Spooner are not in attendance tonight. Myself, Jason Van Fossen, Assistant Superintendent Jeff Lamoureux, Board Clerk Michelle Andrews, and we have 2 guests along with our leadership team that are also in attendance. Cynthia Wambold from CBO and Vanessa DeBrava, our Director of Special Ed, are going to sit in as we do have some questions. I assume you'll have some questions specific to some of our special education figures. So that's why I invited Vanessa to sit in and for you to ask any questions of her to answer them, or try to the best of her ability. So let's get started. Going into 1920, and please ask any questions. This is a work session for the board, so we want to go through this, and I know you've seen this, but if you have any questions, please stop at any point. So we know there are some variables that we're working on right now, and I'll start with the first one, and again, Cynthia, Jeff, jump in wherever. Our only state aid number is that which the governor put out back in January 15th, and that's why it's called the executive proposal, because that's the only number we have. The House and the Senate have put out their bills, their budget numbers. There's a comparison that's been done between the governors, the Houses, and the Senates. At some point, they will come together, and hopefully they will be passed. I will say the Senate and the Assembly, their state aid numbers were relatively higher. I don't want to say significantly higher, but they were higher. They were more favorable But again, until it's finalized, hopefully by April 1st. So the first variable, that's all we know right now, is what the governor has put out. We know our tax levy is 1.86, and while that's better than it's been in other years, it's still under 2%. So again, going back to the tax levy is not 2%, it's whatever the formula drives, and for us it's 1.86. That generates, as you can see, $444,618 additional dollars. So right now, from the revenue standpoint, we're only looking at around 650, and you'll see a more exact number, about $650,000 of new revenue through state aid and through the tax levy, which is not a lot. Also, we know the state has said repeatedly, and I have an asterisk there because the $3.1 billion deficit was discussed during the governor's State of the State, which was also his budget presentation. That number we've heard is anywhere from 2.3 to 2.8. No one has come out and said there's not a deficit. It's just a matter of how large is it. And when there's a state deficit, we always have to be concerned that will be closed, potentially could be closed through numbers, dollars that we would benefit from. So, it is a variable we have to be aware of. And the governor's proposal included a couple of items of concern. Number one, the permanent tax cap, and I know that is, that's a hot button item. It looks on all of the fronts, from the Assembly to the Senate, and obviously to the governor, that they're in favor of making that happen. The benefit would be it's in place, and now we're not waiting for it to be permanent. We know it is, and it's the new reality. But we've been operating as if it was permanent for the last 8 years, and so whether it becomes permanent or not, we've been operating as if it was. Good or bad, if it is permanent, it puts a permanent control on how much we can generate through the community. And we can talk about 60% later on in our budget development, but it is definitely going to be a variable that will impact us. And then the cap on expense-driven aid, there's a proposal to take all of the expense-driven aids and basically lump them together and call it a service aid, or words to that effect. And then there would be a formula, and then that would be capped, and we would be, essentially our aids that we now get that are expense-driven would be one number, one figure. The issue there is, the more we spend, the more we move expenses to, say, BOCES, we generate more aid. There's an incentive to work through BOCES. If it's capped, that no longer is an incentive. And so then you have to wonder and consider, well, what do we do if we're not generating additional aid as a result of using those services? So that's going to be a potential issue we have to consider. And then obviously the number at the bottom is really just, where the rubber hits the road. 96% of our revenue is through the community, through the tax levy, and through state aid. There is no golden apple or money tree that we can find the revenue we need. That's what we're relying on. So I apologize, I know that's a lot, but these are what we're working through right now to try and make sure that this budget is balanced, which ultimately we have to get to.
So effectively, they're starting to flow down the deficit in that cap on expense-driven aid.
Well, it would certainly cap what the state would be spending potentially, and that is not, that they're phasing that in over it would phase in over a couple budget cycles, but when there's a cap, and regardless of how much you spend and you're not generating additional revenue, then it becomes a disincentive. Right now it's an incentive, it becomes a disincentive if that is capped.
So isn't that cross purposes to what BOCES is for?
Well, we feel that way.
When we just had the big push for the consolidation of services that we had to do, was that 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah.
And we had to show that we here's how much we've consolidated services, here's the savings that we got, so on one hand, they pushed us incredibly hard for that, and now 3 years later, they're saying, oh, we're gonna cap some of those expenditure aid, so it's really frustrating.
And it's not done, but it's on the table. You know, obviously, we have to pay attention to that.
And it's been on for numerous other times in past years, I mean, it's always been out there as a discussion topic, but hopefully it doesn't go too far.
This year, it's pretty well fleshed out.
They had a proposal that last year that was along the same lines, and that was not included in the final budget. So there's been a variety of proposals. This year and last year's were more serious, but hopefully this year's will go the same way as last.
Okay. So, moving to the expenditure side variables, we are currently negotiating 4 contracts, and we'll talk about that in the general session. Our single largest growth area, which you'll see, is in our BOCES Special Education Services, and Vanessa will explain where that has come from. We are increasing the use of reserves in this budget from the past, and health insurance, again, continues to increase. So those are variables on the expenditure side that you're going to see through the data that we're dealing with. So let's go over revenue, and again, these are anticipated based on what we know through the governor's proposal. So these are our major revenue categories. Again, last year's what we're proposing, or what we're hoping for, I guess, what we're anticipating, and then the change from dollar to dollar. And again, as we had noted earlier, tax levy, we know, it's been filed. That doesn't mean we can't override it. We've had that conversation before, which we'll talk about later. But right now, we've filed it at that 1.86, so we are in compliance with OSC. You'll note we've appropriated fund balance of $250,000 again, so that's no dollar change. The reserve use, you'll note, from 81 to 553, and that's that increase that I had mentioned in the previous slide. Total other revenue is down slightly, and then total state aid, and it's a negative, and we'll explain that, and you'll see that in another slide. And yeah, there's a note at the bottom that explains that. So the reserve use, we talked about this, and we recognize that using reserves to fill holes year after year after year is not good accounting, and it's not good budgeting. However, we also realize that our employee retirement reserve is very well funded, and it was the recommendation with Kathy and Cynthia that we could use a year's worth of that and still be in very good shape. And actually, it's probably more in line with what the comptroller's office would like to see. Is that fair to say, Cynthia?
That is correct.
So, again, we realize shouldn't be doing that year after year, but for this year, it's actually the appropriate decision to make. Any questions on revenue? And this number, again, is still up in the air. So we're going to focus on expenditures for the remainder. All right, so and I apologize, I shouldn't have concluded that so fast. If you go to, and on the next couple slides, so our tax levy, right now, again, that number is been filed 1.86. Our other revenue categories, so that $1.2 million number, it's broken into a lot of little categories, and we try to explain them so that it's clear and obvious what those are. If you have any questions on what those are, we can certainly answer them, but you'll note that dollar for dollar, it's actually a very little slice of total revenue.
I got a question.
Yep.
Do you know what pilot increased by 61,000?
Millennium Pipeline,
Millennium Pipeline.
we only have two pilots total, so that one's, I think, in the last 5-year cycle of that, Cynthia, is that correct?
It's going from 50% to 75%.
Oh,
So we
So
have
we
that
still
pilot
got
for
one
5
more.
more years.
got one more jump in it then?
In,
So 100%,
in theory, it'll go back to the rolls in 5 more years.
5 more years. Okay.
Well, as long as 5 years, we remind the powers to be that it's done.
Many districts in the area have this particular pilot, so I'm sure that that'll be a topic of discussion
Good.
in 5 years.
And there are other pilots, Good Shepherd homes.
And then the last revenue chart is the state aid and how that's broken out, and this will explain why the negative 293. And we'll talk, first of all, we spotlighted excess cost, high cost, and excess cost private, and we can explain what that is. It's very fascinating when you look at it, so we'll spend a little bit of time on that. If you go to the third item, foundation aid. Foundation aid is essentially your discretionary. That's the state giving you, here's X that you can use for you see fit. It's not tied to any specific item or expense. Dollar for dollar, we're a $52 million budget. That's not a huge increase. That's the number we hope. And the other proposals, the Assembly and the Senate, have significant increases from what the governor had proposed. That's where we could see some growth. Is that fair, Cynthia?
Most likely the growth, yeah, it'll come in foundation aid.
And then building aid, and the explanation for that is we've paid down on our debt, and so the aid is coming in less because we're paying less. Right?
There's no real impact overall for the building aid decrease because debt is offset that almost dollar for dollar, so there's no concern there.
And then our two biggest our two largest expense-driven is after building aid is your transportation and BOCES. You'll note those numbers are going up because we try to utilize those to maximize that aid growth. But dollar for dollar, it's a negative 293. Okay, so now going into expenditures where we want to spend the majority of tonight. So this first chart is really all of the lines, the major lines of the budget. We're going to break each of them out in more detail later on. But probably the most important numbers to focus on for now is the total, $53.6 million. It's a $1.15 million increase, or about 2.2%. This is the number we are working on that we really control at this point.
I have a question.
Yep.
Non-instructional salaries is more than instructional salaries? Why is that?
The increase.
But
So
why
yeah.
would that in general
So one of the big
be
things
more than the instructional?
the biggest thing we got to battle right now is the automatic minimum wage increases.
Ah,
So that's a good chunk of that increase is we don't control that. That's a federal mandate or state mandate.
yep,
Yeah.
that would make sense.
So that affects every
Yeah.
every group in there.
And we have 2 units that we're negotiating. Anything else to add to that?
The only other thing I would add is that in the instructional salaries, we've also taken into consideration retirement breakage.
Right.
And that there's usually more breakage in that line.
In non-instructional, we added some aides after the school, as the school year started, that weren't in the budget. So
Right.
we go budget to budget, kind of regroup and say, here's what it should have been. Start with that as our new benchmark, and we had salary increases, minimum wage increases, and those that come to the
Positions, right.
And for those at home who may not be familiar with these particular terms, in this case, instructional salaries is anyone who is related to the TRS, the teacher retirement system, and non-instructional salaries, even though there are instructional staff there, that's anyone who's related to the employer retirement system. So that's the definition between the two. That's how the state defines that. So even though you have instructional staff in the non-instructional salaries, that's why.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna now, each of these lines will break out in a little more detail. So, first slide, looking at salaries, instructional salaries, so all 100 lines. And again, as Cynthia had mentioned and Jeff, we've got some negotiations, we've had some breakage, we've had a couple additional positions. So, where we see a little bit of savings, we also have some growth, and it's balancing out to about a 2% increase overall in salaries. Any questions? And these are the line, I mean, these are the major lines, so that when you go back to that first chart where you see instructional salaries, these are all of the items underneath that, and we can certainly, you know, if you have questions, that's why we want to do this in detail, so that if you do. But if not, I will move on to the next line, which is 200s, which is equipment. Oh, I'm sorry, non-instructional, forgive me. Those are the non-instructionals broken out, sorry.
One question, is there in substitutes increase? Or is that in anticipation of leaves and things like that?
Again, budget to budget actual, I know this year in non-instructional, I know, for instance, just in maintenance and custodial today, we have 3 people out for at least 8 weeks with surgery related items, so subs are coming in to fill them, they're still getting paid with their sick time and stuff, so it's kind of a combination of, look at the age of the staff and what might be coming down and try to adjust to what you think will happen.
I was just looking at your teacher substitutes line there.
That's non-instructional.
Yeah.
Oh, you're back on the
Yeah,
first
I
one,
did-
teacher
yeah,
substitutes.
yeah, I'm sorry.
You know, we do not use early release days anymore for professional development. So we have, throughout this last year, we've done, we call them roll-throughs, where we call subs in and we roll through a number of teachers to get some professional development. So that line has increased as a result of that versus taking a half day, which really, under the new regulations, we can't. So that's part of it, but again, like Jeff said, we have teachers that go out on a host of different reasons, and
Right, yeah.
you know, and we try to be conservative on that number.
Your expenditures for 17-18, the actual expenditures were around 328,000, and we're anticipating right now that for them to be around that same level this year.
Okay.
It's actually more accurate, right?
Just to, you know,
Yeah.
objectively asking.
Yeah, sure.
You know, there was an increase.
Yeah. Nope. All right, so I'll move on to 200, I apologize, equipment. And, you know, for the computer hardware, that stays relatively flat. We receive state aid and we try to utilize that for those purposes. You see a big jump in the equipment, however, the note, our maintenance trucks are aging out. It's the Northeast. And really, it's the rust and the salt.
Not a lot of miles on them, they just get really rusted out, fuel lines start rusting out and the bottom areas just corrode, so. Overall, I think this is their 8th year, we replaced every one at the same time because of the flood. So we tried, like with the buses, we tried to stagger X amount per year. When they all got flooded, we went off our cycle and bought 7 of them in 1 year. So we'll have to start picking apart the best ones to keep them in the fleet and replace the ones that are falling apart.
Is that how many there are, 7?
There's 7 for maintenance, then we have 1 out of the bus garage and 1 at Maine Memorial as well.
So again, that's pretty easy.
So there's some additional wasn't there issue with the snow blower or something?
Yeah, so we got that in this year. That's in this year.
Oh, okay.
All right, so moving to our largest category by items, contractual and materials and supplies, and this is actually broken up into 2. So this first group, you'll note the largest contractual and other is a large grouping of items all across the district. And so when we looked at that, there isn't really one in particular that has blown up to account for the 114, but there's a lot of growth, 2-3% to factor in for inflation or for fee growth. But this would be an area that we would certainly look at if we need to go back and tighten up. However, you know, when we look at our services, and it's about 4 pages worth of services that are part of this, you know, things pop up that we have to address. So for example, in both of our middle school and high school auditoriums, they have pretty significant and sophisticated audio and tech lighting systems. If something happens, we need to call in an expert from typically Syracuse, I believe, right, we use?
Sensory technology.
Sensory Technology.
And I think they're Rochester. actually.
Rochester, okay. So we need to have these agreements and these contracts to come in, and so if something happens and we have to address it, we have to, you know, it's not something we can just push off. Also, on the special ed side and in the related services side, we have a PT, a speech therapist service that we had to contract with this year to pick up a portion of the services that we lost when we didn't, when we laid off one of our speech therapists last year. So there's a lot of little items that go into this line. And so that's where you see that 114,000.
We also had a very medically frail student enter into the district just a couple months ago and had a contract with an agency to get a one-on-one nurse for her as well, so that's a piece of that. And also renting some medical equipment for her too.
So the next slide is the other half of that. And here's where you're gonna see some of our largest increases. And again, Vanessa's here to help explain some of that. Dollar to dollar in this line though, it's a $1.2 million jump just in that line, in that 400, 500 line. So 472 and 490, and I'll let Vanessa kind of walk through where those are coming from.
So 472, that captures our privately placed students, so an increase in the needs there. And students that are privately placed under that umbrella locally, there is the SUNY CUTE program, which specializes in working with students with autism. And then also the Children's Home of Wyoming Conference, which has a day school, as well as a day treatment program, which is more of a therapeutic program that they have there for students with pretty significant mental health needs, because it wraps around in terms of SED as well as OMH. So the two agencies work together. The Office of Mental Health works with the State Education Department for that program there. And so those are students that you have to go through exhausting all of the possibilities before you place them in those agencies. Obviously, students with autism, we've probably all seen the growth within that realm. And so we currently have 2 students that are in that program that are school age. We have 2 additional students that are currently in that program under CPSE, and they'll be transitioning and staying in that same program. The family and the program and those of us that have visited feel like that's appropriate for them. So they'll be doubling the number of students in that program. And then we've also seen, some students that have exhausted options through some of the public agencies, that then there is an increase in those in the public options as well, like the Children's Home Day School. And then the other line you wanted me to speak to was?
490, the BOCES services.
490. Yep. Overall, in looking at that piece of it, with the BOCES services, this led me to look at the transfer intake meetings, so the new students that have come into the district. So over the last 3 years, I looked from July 1 of the school year till March 11th, just looking earlier this week, to see how many students with special needs we had coming into the district during that time period. And looking at that, during 16, 17, and 17, 18, we had 32 students that came in, and approximately 20% of those students required an out-of-district placement. So the existing IEP that we had to honor coming in required the needs of something out of district. Now, looking at this year, for 18-19, during that same time frame, we had an increase in the number of transfer-ins with special needs, moving up to 39 students, and almost 40% of those students have required an out-of-district placement, either because of physical needs, cognitive needs, and/or behavioral needs.
I'd just like to point out too that the increase, the $659,000 increase, and then plus the other increase in BOCES, that's not all just essentially from the previous year, 17-18 until now. You'll be seeing most likely come June, if not before, significant board transfers to cover the special education needs for this year. We're anticipating BOCES at this point to be over budget by almost $400,000 due to these additional costs and these movements. So that it's not all just essentially from 17-18 right to 19-20. It's been a gradual increase, and we do have a deficit in this year as well.
So where's that money coming from?
That money, a lot of it's gonna come from the health insurance savings that we've achieved this year, and some other areas, so.
So, okay, we're 400 to the good this year, if you recall from last meeting or 2 meetings ago.
Yeah.
So there's money to move around to cover those costs, yeah. But
Yeah,
it works
it's
for a while.
not good, yeah, I know.
So again, when you look, and as we continue on to the next category, which is the sixth debt service, again, our debt service is down. And as Cynthia said, that's where we see, although the cost is down, the corresponding building aid, nets that out. So again, that's not a bad overall to have less debt. Go on to the next slide, which is benefits. We are seeing, we're seeing some benefits. I think the TRS is obviously a benefit. That is a fluctuating number. So it's good now. It could turn next year. So we're thankful there. The unemployment insurance, we made layoffs last year. That number was higher for that reason. So while there's a decrease there, it's not a performance decrease, other than thankfully we're not proposing any layoffs. So again, you gotta take that with a grain of salt. And then the health insurance, dollar for dollar, is lower. And there are some factors, and you'll note in the notes, some of the factors there. And, better performance in other areas, this savings would have been even better, as Cynthia just noted, so. But it's still growing, as I had noted in the beginning. And then the last item for expenditures is our interfund transfers. The $100,000 is for the $100,000 capital project that we're allowed to do each year. Cafeteria, we have to cover the cafeteria, because obviously they can't go in a deficit. We're responsible for that on the general fund, and then the transfers for special ed. And you'll note the note below is the explanation for that. So in total, preliminarily, we are looking at, and you can see the numbers, we're currently at a $535,000 deficit. And we've done some work to get to this point. We know there's still work to do. However, our big factor right now is on the revenue side to determine how much revenue will come in additionally from state aid before we can really make any more final decisions. But, when push comes to shove and we need to come with a final budget proposal for adoption, we'll obviously address that number. So that's what we're looking at today. Any questions on that? Okay. All right.
So
Oh.
I do have one
Yeah.
question. I'd like to go back to your answer to Ken's question.
Yeah.
Could you repeat that again?
So Ken had asked where we get money to fund a deficit created just within the special ed population.
Right.
But if you look at our overall performance for the entire budget, we're just over 400, Cynthia?
This year.
Just on
Around
this
there.
year.
Mhm.
So we can take money from savings and health insurance and move it over to cover the cost of special ed kids. And then we adjust the budget for next year to account for that. So that's kind of the moving target as
So
well.
that's already, pardon the expression, that's already been sucked up, that savings.
No,
that we had
because,
this
so
year.
again, we still have 400,000 with moving money to cover the cost of the special ed kids. Yeah, but it's accounted for,
Oh, okay.
yes.
Okay.
So I guess I want to say that's,
Does that-
yes.
Not extra money, that's all, but it comes.
Yeah.
So does that affect the fund balance number?
We've taken that into consideration already in the fund balance number.
So the 490 or whatever we had in February, end of February, that's the,
It's the
So
surplus you were talking
Yeah,
about.
we're still
Yeah.
thinking around 400, somewhere in the $400,000 range. Mhm.
Because I want to have a discussion about that, and
Yeah.
where that ends up going.
right?
Okay, right. Maybe
Yeah.
that 4% limit is something that we don't care about anymore. Okay.
Not what Cynthia wants to hear.
Well, I know, but we're the, that's a.
Well, I think in a future workshop, we'll have to have that conversation, but for now, until we know the revenue side through the state budget, we're still.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And another thing to take into consideration is both the Assembly and the Senate have proposed a TRS reserve, which is going to be huge if that goes through. This is the best progress we've had on this ever. It's never been in the budget bills before. It's been in the June bills and hasn't gotten the whole way through either house there. That both houses have put this and agreed to have it in their proposals is a really hopeful sign that the TRS reserve will go through.
But going back to your question, Craig, so look at the ERS reserve amount we're using this year. That's where surplus goes. You create surplus in certain years, you move it into a capital reserve, you move it into an ERS reserve, now we're using it. So, I wanna make sure everybody's clear. We're using what we've saved in previous years in this budget to close that gap almost in half. So again, I agree with Jason, having that conversation going forward, but the larger that amount that you're using, it can't go this way year after year. It's gotta start at a number and level or stay below
I
that, or,
understand
you know.
that, but when you save money throughout the year.
And again, so we're using $500,000 this year,
Got it,
you know,
got it.
Lower.
yeah.
You know, just a side note on Cynthia's comment about the TRS reserve, that originated out of this area,
Yeah.
so that would be wonderful.
Well, we've seen the benefit of the ERS reserve,
Right.
significant.
Right.
And that's, what, about a quarter, a third of the cost annually compared to TRS?
It's substantially less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, to get a TRS reserve, like Cynthia said, that would be incredible.
I think there will be limits on it that we don't have on the ERS reserve, but it's 3 times, Jeff, the cost of TRS.
Just
I got
start.
another question, totally not in what we're talking about now. Do you know how they came up with the 2% number? Is that based on anything, or is that just somebody said 2% sounds like a good number?
2% fund balance?
Tax.
No,
Oh, tax.
Tax cap over.
I think they looked at, if I remember correctly, something to do with the trend in inflation.
Yes.
They looked at a 20-year period backwards and used
Yeah.
inflationary numbers to say, this looks like a good number.
So CPI, and then they took out energy costs, and they took out food costs, and they just averaged it over a 20-year period, and they took the consumer price index.
Right.
Less fuel and less food, and they came up with that number, which came out to actually.
And health costs, they took
Right.
health costs. I think.
Which is
Oh,
like
it's
2.06, what it's actually came to, and then it rounded down to like 2%.
I could be wrong, but I think that's where the 2% originally came
Yeah.
from, was looking at the trend in
Of course, we
CPI.
don't pay for those things.
Or the
It's
thing
okay.
that drive us.
Okay, so moving on to the drivers, and we put this in here just as, you know, people ask us this all the time, and obviously, as a board, you know, you wanna know. But here's where we're at, here's the drivers for this current for the 1920 projected budget. We have built in a full-time special education teacher, is built into this budget. A full-time teacher aide for a special ed classroom is built into this budget. You've seen the increase in special ed costs at BOCES, Vanessa addressed. The tuition at private placements, we've addressed. Contractual increases, as we, you know, again, we're negotiating, and those have to now be enacted. I noted miscellaneous contractual, so I mentioned there's, you know, numerous contractual increases, but 2 in particular, you know, musical instrument rentals. You know, we rent quite a few instruments, and we have a very robust music program. And in talking with Jackie Kovac as lead teacher for the music department, you know, we're at a position where we're having conversations around, do we buy or do we rent? You know, and right now we're doing a little bit of both. And we're trying to study if there's a better, what makes more sense, to rent to own, to rent, or to buy. And so we've seen increases in rentals. A lot of that has to do with the numbers of enrollment and students wanting to play and not having the ability to have instruments. But that's just an area we're looking at to study to see if there's a better way of addressing that. Maintenance service agreements, you know, again, they're part of doing business. And then adjustments to actuals, as Cynthia said, we've been budgeting $290 for substitute teachers, yet we're really spending $325. We need to adjust that to be more an actual. versus under budgeting. So, and then health insurance. So you take all of those factors, these are the drivers for the 19-20 budget. If anyone asks or if there's interest, we can point to them. Now, we spotlighted an area, and this is more for education, but we think it's pretty fascinating. And first glance, you might say, why aren't we doing private excess or private versus high cost? I wanted Vanessa just to kind of break this down, and Cynthia put this together, this calculation. So when you look at those numbers and you ask, well, how do those numbers get generated? There's the formula and there's the process, and thank you, Cynthia, for doing that. When we sat down with Vanessa, Vanessa explained the process you have to go through in order to qualify for these two. So I wanted just to take a second and break that out. Vanessa?
Yeah, so the public is, under that umbrella is anybody in district, is anybody at BOCES, so you have your threshold amount, which is around $35,000. So if you have a student that they're programming, which could include the teacher, the aide, the related services, any other supports they might have would be encapsulated into that. 60,000 is obviously over our threshold, so you would take off the threshold amount, and then that excess cost you would get 72.9% of that back in high cost aid. Now, if you wanted to look at a private, obviously the threshold there is much lower, which makes it look like, wow, we definitely would want to go with that. And your aid ratio is obviously significantly higher, so you would get a lot more excess cost aid back on that. However, I just want to caution you in that when you place a student in a private placement, you have to go through a DCERT process first through the high cost accountability website it's not a website, that's their database. In the DCERT, one of the pieces there is that you have to ensure that you've gone through all public options first. So you have to have exhausted those, and then the student's need has to then warrant then you going to a private placement. So it can't just be everybody that's in your current public options could then go to private. It's a very selective, high needs group within a specialized realm of placements. Like I said, locally, the SUNY program as well as the children's home, and then there's a myriad of other more residential-based programming or day school programming, but not local, that you could access as well within that based on specialized needs. So when you look at those pieces, you have to weigh those factors as well.
So going back to, if you remember the numbers Cynthia just had said in terms of our intake report, as we see special ed numbers increase, I said to Jason, let's just make sure people understand. You're expected to contribute $36,000 out of the district's monies to pay for every student that comes in the door, regular ed, special ed. If it goes over that amount, then you'll get the excess cost aid. But we're only getting about 30 cents on every dollar we spend for a kid that goes to a BOCES or an in-house placement. So there's still a significant cost that we bear for kids that, continually come in on the intake report into our district and our foundation aid. So if we get 10 more kids on the public side at a net cost of $40,000 each, that's a $400,000 increase. You go back to our revenue side, we just got $272,000 in foundation aid. So the struggle we're having is the foundation aid really doesn't reflect enrollment increases. I think the assumption a lot of times is there's decreases, you're held harmless. So if you got this amount last year, you'll get the same amount and some more next year. So we're struggling with that in terms of how many kids are coming in requiring the services. But we hear a lot of times, you'll get aid on those kids, so it's not that big a deal. Yeah, we do get aid if they go over 36,000, but a lot of kids don't hit that threshold. So we're still providing additional supports beyond what we do for general ed kids, but we're not getting any aid until they hit 36,000, and then even at 36,000, it's 72.9% of every dollar that goes over that. So it's a big cost. So when you look at the next slide Jason shows, our total general ed cost of $6 million, we're getting like 1.7, 1.8 of those costs back in terms of the aid value. So there's a significant local share every time a kid comes in the door that requires special ed. And I think last week alone, 2 families, maybe 3 came in with 8 kids. And I don't know what the level of service they need is, but we're seeing a lot of those transitional kids coming into the district.
And the only reason why, we share this, and we use 60,000 for apples to apples. There's only a handful of BOCES programs that are, that are 60,000. Many are below our threshold. However, it just shows you the difference. But when you look at this chart, special ed is a variable. It's not a constant cost that we can factor 2% every year and just roll it over. It's people, it's families. They move in, they have needs. We're bound by law to meet those needs. They come in, they leave. It's a fluctuating number. When you look over the last several years, what's interesting is while it has sawtoothed a little bit, it's been relatively constant. I mean, when you trend it and you average it, it's been relatively, yeah, it's been reasonable to factor and to base projections off of. This is a year that would be an outlier year that has jumped pretty significant. So, every year, the last several years, we've been able to look at a certain area. It's been health insurance the past three budget development, last three budgets that has been the big factor. This year, we have a sizable increase in special ed. So, it's really this is just to show you, graphically, data-wise, why the budget is where it's at.
So, Jason, is
Yep.
the increase that we're seeing with the special ed needs, is that just a Maine-Endwell thing, or is that a region-wide thing? That all the school districts are seeing an increase in those needs? And if they are, is it relative to ours? Is it the same kind of jump, or is this really a Maine-Endwell issue?
Like Cynthia could probably answer that better than.
I think that there's been an uptick in special education across the region, but I also see the trend where it kind of moves from district to district. And so you will have a couple years of an increase and then it levels off or even decreases for a little bit. I've seen that happen routinely. So not all districts in the region are seeing a significant increase like this in this coming year. But sort of everyone has their turn at it, if I can describe it like that. That's just the way it seems.
Or the other way to look at it
looking all the
is, we have
districts.
39 more kids coming on the intake report, most of them are from local schools.
Yes,
A few were from outside the area,
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
so again, if we're picking up 32 out of 39 locally,
Mhm.
32 are lost at other schools, unless they're getting kids from outside the area moving into their districts,
Yeah.
we're moving it around, like Cynthia said.
So that within the region, it's not like they're coming, the majority of them are not coming from outside of our region.
Right.
In our district, I
Right.
can't speak for the other 14 BOCES schools, but when we look at our own intake, the kids that were there, I think they were coming from Binghamton,
Yep.
so they just,
Johnson said.
Yeah, many of the students were just maintaining in the same, BOCES program or privately placed program that is already in the BT BOCES area. And, I completely agree with what Cynthia said, because in doing this for 13 years, that is certainly what you see. There's certain years where you're like, wow, what's going on here? And then all of a sudden, it'll level out. And, so I think across the region, that's pretty typical.
So moving into our next area, which is wish list, and I added this, this is an area that, we based on what we're trying to do in the high school, based on current enrollment, based on current programming, this is a position that we could use in the high school. Again, maybe this budget cycle, it doesn't work, but this is an area that we're gonna continue to investigate, and we would like to invest in. So I put that on there for your consideration as well. And then the last left to dos, and we've kind of already talked about this, we're gonna look at all of our retirements and resignations, we're gonna review our budget requests, and then we're gonna wait for the New York State budget. And within those three, we will come to that $535,000 deficit and have a balanced budget by April 11th. So, still some work to do, but, we're in pretty good shape.
I got a question.
Sure.
So back on the musical instruments, wouldn't it be true that it might be easier to get grants or gifts if we were purchasing instruments as opposed to renting instruments?
I couldn't answer that. I know our lead teacher is in attendance tonight. I don't want to put her on the spot, but Jackie, do you have any insight on that?
I actually just tried to reach out to some other school districts and see what they're doing. And it's kind of the run of the mill, everyone. I think our biggest concern right now is so many students are coming in not able to rent and purchase their own, so that's kind of where, and our inventory is aging.
Yeah.
So it's getting difficult. I know one of our new teachers, Miss Nick, has been looking into some grants for string programs. So we're trying to find what is available. What we're finding mostly is we're in a district and position where we're not meeting the needs of some of those grants because where we are economically still. I don't know if maybe possibly Maine Memorial might be more able to because of the Title I designation. So as a district, we're not necessarily eligible for some of the grants that are out there, but we're gonna keep looking. Right, you're building.
So our preliminary recommendations, we have 3, and one of them I do want to stop and make sure that we review. First of all, this has been a recommendation for the last 5 or 6 years, and we continue to hold to that we want to stay or keep up to 4% or as close to that in that unallocated fund balance, which is that money that has not been assigned to a particular item or reserve.
It does say maintain a minimum fund balance of 4%.
And we've tried very hard to stick to that letter of the law. I think
Says
our
minimum-
average,
It says minimum.
I know,
Intends
I know.
to maintain.
We've stated about 3.75 the last several years, 3.8.
That's always our goal.
Yeah. So thank you for catching that, but that's gonna continue to be our recommendation. Second recommendation is to stay within the tax levy. Now, I know last year we had a conversation, there was discussion, there was, a special meeting to review that. We still hold that there are significant disincentives to try to reach that 60%. And here's the one that we, here's the one that we think is the biggest disincentive for the community, for those that don't have students actively in school or aren't,
Get the rebate.
or aren't fixed incomes. Right, there's this property tax relief credit, I think it's going into its 3rd year, 4th year, something? Third. These are the eligibility requirements, and this is the check people get in, I don't say in the fall, or is that in the spring? When does that one come?
November last time.
Yeah, okay, late fall. So just to give you an example, we talked about this last year, and I wanted to make sure I was clear on this. So this is if you qualify for Basic Star. So there's Enhanced Star and there's Basic Star. Enhanced Star has a fixed percentage that you can qualify for, that you are, 34%, Cynthia, you had said that is the magic number for Enhanced.
For Enhanced Star, it's 34% next year.
So for Basic, the number I highlighted in blue, this is the disincentive. So if I'm a family making $75,000 or less, if the school district, and I pay taxes and I have children that attend the school, if the school stays within the tax levy limit, there's my potential credit back as a result of the school staying under the tax levy limit. So when you add that up and you run the numbers, politically, and I know we're not political, but politically it's a really difficult decision to make, knowing that it's going to impact more than 2/3 of your taxpayers in your community that aren't parents. So, we put this out here not to scare, but just to say, and I use the town of Maine and the town of Union. That's the 2 biggest. That's almost
So 90-some percent.
97, 96% of our community. So that's why we're recommending we stay within the tax levy limit.
And I think last year we run I think the average tax bill was $3,000 in the 2 towns. So again, to go over the tax threshold, you're asking people to basically pay a 15% tax increase at $711 to forego that to help pay their tax bill. So it's a sizable chunk of money.
Then our last recommendation, I would ask Mr. Auble, our Director of Auxiliary Services, to just provide a brief overview of why we have a transportation bus replacement plan, which has been in place for probably well over 10 years, Mike?
Well, for as long as I've been
Okay.
here, which has been 11 years overseeing transportation. We have 39 buses, we have 2, we previously had 2 vans, we bought an SUV last year.
We try to buy 4 buses every year and rotate them, and at the end of 11 years, we'll have gone through the buses. The biggest, as it was mentioned earlier, our engines are fine, it's the bodies of the buses that are falling apart after 10 or 11 years because of all the salt. So our buses are in great shape, we have a great DOT inspection rate. Several years ago, Rochester, I believe, was a school district that they neglected buying buses for a long period of time and had to purchase lots of them. So we get 90% aid back on them. It's amortized over 5 years. We have it laddered such that the impact from year to year is minimal, and actually our buses are in good shape when we get rid of them at the auction, so we're able to pretty much cover the cost, the first payment with that trade-in or with that auction value.
And in the past, Mike, there was a year or two where we altered our replacement plan, and we've seen some consequences of that. We want to stay to that plan,
Well,
correct?
several years ago, when we were in a budget crisis, we ended up reducing the amount of buses we purchased over a 3-year period. And basically what that has done is our buses that we are sending to auction now have 130 to 140,000 miles on them, as opposed to maybe 110. So, I mean, we're still in good shape, we have good mechanics.
And we've said all along, with the aid factored in, it's the best investment we can make. There's no reason not to continue with the replacement plan. So I wanted to just make sure that we had a chance to review that. You guys have any questions for Mr. Allwell regarding this?
I don't know if it's a question for Mike, but that cap that we're talking about, transportation, and does that affect buses?
Yes, it will. And so, if, for instance, you had to go out in a future year with more buses, if you were to reduce buses, like say now, that you would potentially not get aid as much, you would not get as much aid in the future because it would be capped, so,
I mean, I realize it's a proposal, but
yeah.
it sounds,
I think the
we'll have to
important
watch
point,
that space. But
I really agree, with the, keeping the bus replacement plan steady, at that same level, that's really important. And, not only for maintaining the buses, but it also maintains the impact to the tax levy limit, keeping that as steady as possible as well.
It also keeps the maintenance costs down too.
Yeah.
I mean, our biggest factor on the bus run side, probably on the expenditures, is diesel fuel.
Yeah.
If that spikes, we can't control it, and, we would fall, and that's where I hope that doesn't come to fruition, because if we see a 20-30% spike in diesel fuel costs for something we can't control, and it's capped and we lose, $30,000-$40,000 in aid, that's frustrating.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I agree, it's a good
I'm sorry.
point.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I want to understand what the implications of that cap were on this transportation.
We can get aid back on all of these purchases, including the minivan, because there's transporting students, but like the maintenance vehicles, we
Maintenance.
say. Yeah, okay.
We get aid on the salaries of the maintenance guys who plow, when they do plow-related stuff, because it's removing snow for transportation reasons. But that's minimal compared to the 90%.
The other item is that this purchase, 3 buses, the 1 small bus, and minivan, is its own separate proposition during the budget, or during the vote. So, at the next meeting, when you approve the language, this is specific language that we have to have. And that's why I wanted to make sure that you were comfortable with it.
And don't we always see that comes in at less of a plurality of approval than the regular budget does? Don't we always see that there's less people vote in favor of the bus purchase than vote in favor of the? Really?
Actually, I think it's the other way around.
Yeah.
That was the other
Yeah.
way around.
Okay.
It's higher support. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
Probably
thought when you
2/3.
were talking, I was shocked.
Yeah.
Didn't get this.
Okay, so at this point, if the board has any other questions, we are getting close to our 7 o'clock time. I will have a session in my report where we can go back and have that conversation. And then for anyone who's home, again, just reminding folks, there's the email address to send any of your questions. And that our next 2 budget workshops, which are the next 2 meetings, will also be live streamed. So, any other questions for the board?
If if we got to the last meeting and we still didn't know the state numbers, the final numbers, would we have a special meeting after that? If it was an impact, I mean, if it was a couple $100,000, it really changed, you know, what we were gonna do. We got more than we
Oh.
were thinking.
I guess,
What's the 30-day date, April 21st?
24th maybe, that's that Friday. So
So if that would
you could delay adopting your budget from, earlier in April to later in April.
I
If
just-
the state has not approved the budget by April 1st.
Okay.
3 weeks.
so thank you Cynthia, thank you Vanessa, and thank you everyone in attendance, and thank you those folks that are listening live. This concludes our first budget workshop, thank you. I think we've got a minute, you guys need to use the bathroom or
Yeah.
get a coffee.
Wow, that's-